Pol Pot, the madman who tried to erase Cambodia. In April 1975, a quiet, smiling man in a black peasant's shirt walked into Phnom Penh and promised a new dawn for Cambodia. 4 years later, the nation lay in ruins, and nearly 2 million people were dead. This is the story of Pol Pot, the dictator who turned his country into a graveyard. Pol Pot was born Saloth Sar in 1925 into a comfortable rural family. A scholarship to Paris exposed him to radical Marxist ideas. And by the time he returned to Cambodia in 1953, he had a vision, not for reform, not for gradual change, but for the complete destruction of the old world to build a new one from scratch. During the chaos of the Vietnam War, the Khmer Rouge gained strength, exploiting instability and anger. On April 17, 1975, they seized Phnom Penh. Crowds cheered, believing the civil war was finally over. They were wrong. Within hours, soldiers wearing red scarves began ordering every man, woman, and child to leave the city. Hospitals were emptied. Patients were wheeled into the streets with IVs still in their arms. Anyone who resisted inland was shot. Pol Pot called this Year Zero, a reset of history itself. Cities were abandoned, money abolished, schools closed, religion banned. Wearing glasses, speaking a foreign language, or even appearing educated could be a death sentence. Millions were forced into the countryside to work as peasants. Food was scarce, tools primitive, hours endless, and anyone too weak to work was discarded without mercy. The killings began almost immediately. Former officials, teachers, monks, intellectuals, anyone seen as a threat, were rounded up and taken to interrogation centers like Tuol Sleng, a former school turned torture chamber. Prisoners were beaten, electrocuted, and mutilated until they confessed to imaginary crimes, then executed. Their bodies were dumped in shallow pits. These became the infamous killing fields, open graves where the earth would later reveal thousands of skulls. Pol Pot's paranoia spiraled out of control. Ethnic minorities such as Vietnamese, Chinese, and Cham Muslims were targeted for extermination. Even members of the Khmer Rouge, who were suspected of disloyalty, could vanish overnight. Children were separated from parents and taught to spy on their own families. By 1979, famine, disease, and mass executions had claimed the lives of nearly a quarter of Cambodia's population. When Khmer Rouge forces attacked across the Vietnamese border, the response was swift. Vietnam invaded. Within weeks, Phnom Penh fell. This time, it was liberation. Pol Pot fled into the jungle, still leading guerrilla fighters and still denying his crimes. For nearly 2 decades, he evaded justice. It wasn't until 1997 that his own followers turned on him, placing him under house arrest. A year later, he died quietly in his sleep, never facing trial, never answering for the mountains of bones left in his wake. Pol Pot promised to build a perfect society. Instead, he erased a quarter of his people, proving that in the hands of a dictator, even utopia can become hell. Adolf Hitler, the man behind the Holocaust. In 1933, a man with fiery speeches and promises of national pride took control of Germany. He vowed to rebuild the country, to give its people dignity again. But behind that promise was something far darker, a plan for persecution, war, and mass murder on a scale the world had never seen. This is the story of Adolf Hitler, the man responsible for the Holocaust. Hitler was born in Austria in 1889. He drifted through life without much purpose until World War I, where he fought for Germany and came home furious over its defeat. That bitterness grew into an obsession. He believed Germany's enemies weren't just foreign nations, but whole groups of people, most of all the Jews. By the early 1920s, he was leading the Nazi Party, preaching racial purity and violent nationalism. When he took power in 1933, he wasted no time turning those words into policy. Jewish businesses were boycotted, books were burned, political opponents arrested. The Gestapo and the SS became instruments of fear, silencing anyone who spoke out. Then came the Nuremberg Laws in 1935, stripping Jews of citizenship, banning marriage between Jews and non-Jews, and making them second-class citizens in their own country. In 1938, Kristallnacht, the Night of Broken Glass, unleashed a wave of destruction. Synagogues burned, Jewish shops were smashed, and thousands were arrested and sent to camps. When World War II began, the persecution escalated into something even more horrific. Across occupied Europe, Jewish families were forced into ghettos, walled-off districts where disease and starvation spread like wildfire. From there, trains carried millions to concentration camps. Some camps, like Dachau and Buchenwald, worked prisoners to death. Others, like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor, were built for one purpose only: mass extermination. Prisoners were herded into gas chambers disguised as showers, their bodies burned in crematoria. By 1945, 6 million Jews had been murdered, along with millions of Romani people, disabled individuals, Soviet prisoners of war, and political dissidents. Hitler's atrocities weren't limited to the Holocaust. His war left entire cities in ruins, starved populations, and claimed over 70 million lives worldwide. In the Soviet Union, entire villages were wiped out. In Eastern Europe, civilians were executed as reprisals. And in the final months of the war, he ordered a scorched earth policy, destroying his own country's infrastructure as the Allies closed in. By April 1945, the Third Reich was collapsing. Berlin was in flames and Soviet troops were closing in on the Führer bunker. Hitler, unwilling to face justice, took his own life on April 30th. He left behind a legacy of genocide, destruction, and suffering so vast, it defies comprehension. Adolf Hitler's rule is a warning of how hatred, unchecked, can consume nations and destroy millions of lives. Joseph Stalin, the man who ruled through fear. In 1924, after the death of Vladimir Lenin, Joseph Stalin rose to power in the Soviet Union. He promised a workers' paradise, a nation of equality and progress. Instead, he delivered purges, forced labor, and man-made famine that killed millions. This is the story of Stalin, a dictator who built his empire on fear and death. Born Yosef Jugashvili in 1878 in Georgia, Stalin came from poverty. A revolutionary from a young age, he was drawn to the Bolshevik cause and quickly proved himself ruthless. When the Bolsheviks seized power in 1917, Stalin climbed the ranks, and after Lenin's death, he outmaneuvered his rivals to take complete control. Once in power, Stalin pushed to industrialize the Soviet Union at breakneck speed. He forced millions of peasants into collective farms, seizing their land and grain. In Ukraine, his policies triggered the Holodomor, a man-made famine from 1932 to 1933 that killed millions. Villages starved while grain was exported abroad. Reports tell of people eating grass, bark, even resorting to cannibalism just to survive. But famine was only part of the terror. From 1936 to 1938, Stalin unleashed the Great Purge. Political rivals, military leaders, scientists, artists, anyone who might oppose him, were arrested, tortured, and executed. Ordinary citizens were denounced by neighbors and dragged from their homes at night, never to be seen again. Those who weren't shot were sent to the Gulag, a vast network of forced labor camps. In freezing wilderness and scorching deserts, prisoners mined coal, cut timber, and built railways under brutal conditions. Many never made it out alive. During World War II, Stalin's leadership helped defeat Nazi Germany, but his cruelty didn't stop for the war. He ordered scorched earth retreats that destroyed towns and left civilians with nothing. Whole ethnic groups, Chechens, Crimean Tatars, and others, were deported thousands of miles to inhospitable lands, accused of treason with no proof. Countless people died during the forced journeys. Even after victory in 1945, repression continued. The secret police watched every citizen, dissent was crushed, and Stalin's cult of personality portrayed him as a wise, fatherly leader, hiding the truth of his brutality. By the time Stalin died in 1953, tens of millions had suffered under his rule. Some mourned him. Others finally felt safe enough to breathe. Joseph Stalin promised to build a workers' utopia. Instead, he left behind a legacy of fear, oppression, and death, proof that absolute power can destroy a nation from within. Saddam Hussein, the butcher of Baghdad. In 1979, a man in a military uniform stood before a room full of government officials in Baghdad. One by one, he read out names. Each man called was led away and executed. It was his first act as Iraq's new president, and a sign of the brutal rule to come. This is the story of Saddam Hussein, the dictator who ruled through fear, war, and bloodshed. Saddam was born in 1937 in a poor village near Tikrit. His childhood was harsh, beatings, poverty, and political instability all around him. By his 20s, he had joined the Ba'ath Party, a pan-Arab nationalist movement. It wasn't long before he proved himself willing to use violence to get what he wanted. Assassinations, intimidation, nothing was off the table. When he became president in 1979, Saddam wasted no time cementing his power. That purge of political rivals was just the beginning. Iraq became a police state. Secret police spied on everyone, dissent was crushed, and torture chambers filled with political prisoners. Then came war. In 1980, Saddam launched a bloody 8-year conflict with neighboring Iran. Hundreds of thousands died on both sides. Iraqi forces used chemical weapons against Iranian troops and against their own people. In 1988, in the Kurdish town of Halabja, Saddam's forces unleashed poison gas, killing around 5,000 civilians in a single day. It was one of the worst chemical attacks on a civilian population in history. Under his rule, entire ethnic groups suffered. The Kurds faced mass executions and forced displacement in what became known as the Anfal campaign, a campaign of genocide. Shia Muslims, suspected of opposing the regime, were arrested, tortured, and killed by the thousands. In 1990, Saddam invaded Kuwait, triggering the Gulf War. His forces looted the country, set its oil fields on fire, and committed atrocities against civilians. When coalition forces drove him out, he brutally crushed uprisings at home, killing tens of thousands in the process. Throughout the 1990s, Iraq suffered under crushing international sanctions. While ordinary Iraqis struggled to find food and medicine, Saddam lived in palaces filled with gold, marble, and luxury. In 2003, the U.S. and its allies invaded Iraq, accusing Saddam of possessing weapons of mass destruction. The regime collapsed within weeks, and Saddam went into hiding. That December, U.S. forces found him hiding in a hole near his hometown of Tikrit. 3 years later, after being tried and convicted for crimes against humanity, including the killing of 148 people in the town of Dujail, Saddam Hussein was hanged. He died defiant, still claiming he had been a patriot. But his legacy is one of mass graves, chemical attacks, and decades of fear. Saddam Hussein promised to make Iraq strong. Instead, he left behind a country broken by war, divided by hatred, and scarred by the memory of his rule.